Hey, Laura. Hey, Stephanie. Thank you all for having us.
So, do you want to start by reading your passage of The Saddest Girl on the Beach?
I can do that. I was just going to read just a few pages, so a really brief reading, and I'm just going to start from the beginning, so you don't have to know anything else other than what I'm going to read to you. So this is from chapter 1. My hand was bleeding when I touched Nate for the first time since I'd arrived at the inn, when he glided his kayak across the Pamlico Sound and pushed up beside me on the dock. I'd reached out to grab the paddle as Nate pulled the kayak in, scraping myself on the rough post of the dock as I stretched out over the water. Tiny red rivulets ran down my wrists and dripped on the pier, the bright crimson out of place on this dimly bruised January day. A sharp wind kicked up whitecaps, ruffling the muted reeds until they bent their heads low. Nate grabbed my right hand, cold beads of water dripping off his arm and landing on my own. He brushed at the red and saw that it came from a thin scratch. Stigmata? He asked lightly, wiping the blood away. The old me, the one standing in front of the dividing line of my father's death, would have laughed and made devil horns. This new me only vaguely recognized that Nate's question was intended to be lighthearted. The water lapped against the dock and I closed my eyes. Charlotte? Nate asked, his voice soft. Are you okay? He pulled my hand closer to his chest. The scratch started to throb, and it felt like something I could anchor myself to. I opened my eyes and turned away. Back at the inn, a light flicked on, illuminating a second-story window. I nodded. Fine, I said, through the tightness of my throat. I pulled back from him and ran my other hand across the rough post, pressing down to see if I could bleed again, to see if I could feel something. I stopped when I saw Nate watching me. How was kayaking? I asked. Nate shrugged. Chilly, but I needed some water time after being stuck on the mainland. I'd been here for 3 days, but Nate had been visiting friends in Raleigh the whole time. The breeze kicked up, damp and fish smelling. I knew I should ask about his trip, force a smile, and listen with interest, but the prospect exhausted me. I'm going to go back and help with dinner, I said. The wind lashed my cheeks as I walked down the boardwalk, heading toward the light. The Pamlico Inn was the only thing keeping me steady, the inn and the water. I was otherwise loose, untethered, and distant from my brother, James, and my mother. I couldn't stand to be with them now that our family was only 3. At home, I'd been constantly aware of the friction caused by my father's absence, the space where he should have been. My father, stable and strong and reassuring, a beacon. He had been gone for 6 months now. Gone. 9 years ago, when I was 10 years old, the National Park Service moved the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. I thought it would crumble and fall, afraid its solid striped body, the steady golden sweep of its beam across the night, would be lost. The Park Service was moving the lighthouse away from the pounding waves and eroding ocean. But I imagined the black and white spirals, all 208 feet of them, swaying, rocking left, right, catching momentum, crashing to the sand, piles of black and white bricks. Everywhere dust, rising and billowing and choking me with grit. Days later, I would still be spitting out rogue grains when I brushed my teeth. But the lighthouse didn't fall. It just moved, the glimpse of black and white spirals no longer visible from Lighthouse View Road, the rotating beam now illuminating maritime forest instead of dunes and beach and frothy waves. Still, what once was can haunt a person, can make them run away from home. And this is where I ran, where I landed, this great gray seashell of an inn tumbled onto the shore. I was still running. I ran away from Nate, up the boardwalk and toward the inn, the cuts on my palms stinging against the salty breeze. The inn had 3 stories, with ramps along the outside connecting the new addition to the original, with lace curtains fringing the windows of rooms named after North Carolina wildflowers. My best friend Evie Austin's parents owned it. The inn closed every year for the month of January, so the Austins let me choose whichever room I wanted. I picked a small yellow room overlooking the Sound, the Primrose Room, in the old part of the inn. I liked it because of its coziness, and I liked being close to the family quarters. Mr. and Mrs. Austin had a bedroom tucked behind the office in the original part of the inn, along with a living space, and Evie and Nate had rooms overlooking the garden, since tourists wanted a water view. Once I was inside the inn, I went upstairs, hid in the Primrose Room, and let myself cry about my dad. I felt so stupid getting upset in front of other people, hated the way the grief still rose in my throat unexpectedly. It had been 6 months now, 6 months and 18 days. Someone knocked at the door and I wiped my face with my bleeding hands. Don't, I said. You better have pants on, Evie said, pushing the door open. She stood with a hand on her hip, her eyes shadowed. Then she rushed forward, touched my face, and pulled back, her fingers damp, red. Why is your face all bloody? Evie asked. She pulled a tissue from the side table and rubbed my cheeks. I showed her my hand. There's something sharp on the dock post, I said. Evie took the band-aids and put them on my palm. I swallowed hard, swallowed again, and stared at Evie as her dark hair fell forward, shiny and straight and long. She threw away the band-aid wrappers and I sat down on my bed. When are you going to unpack? Evie asked, pulling a pair of pink socks out of my bag and tossing them at me. You're home. I shrugged and let the socks fall. I didn't bother telling her that nothing was permanent, not even home, especially not home. That I had watched my father die, packed my bags, and left for my first semester of college because he had wanted me to go, because everyone said it would take my mind off it. Him. September, October, November, I did everything but think about him. I unpacked my luggage and hung posters on the walls of my dorm room. And then in December, Evie had called to tell me that she was pregnant, mingled notes of apology and terror in her voice. 2 weeks before finals, I took a leave of absence from school. The form I filled out asked the reason for my departure. Life and death, I wrote. Melodramatic? Yes, but that's how I was feeling at the time. And I left the solid Midwest and came down here to the Outer Banks, to this improbable strip of islands, this narrow, shifting place, more water than land, to be with my friend, to stare at the water and make everything go away. And I'll stop there.
I don't remember if I've done a virtual book talk before, so it's like I assume everybody is clapping. Like,
Just imagine it.
it's a different feeling. Wow. I mean, I just want everyone who's watching this today to know I'm gonna do my best to ask things I'm genuinely curious about with how you created this brilliant book. And at the same time, really try not to spoil anything, because just from that first chapter alone, what you just read, I mean, that was only part of the first chapter, wasn't it? It was just the beginning of it. And you've already set into motion so many different paths to walk down with these different characters in this book, like already. And, as soon as I started reading your book, I believe it was back in April, you gave me an early copy of it. And I, at the time, was sort of grieving my book tour and dealing with the fact that the excitement was sort of dying down a little bit, but really thinking a lot about missing my dad. And that one line in that first chapter where you said, my dad would never see a Hatteras winter, that really stuck out to me at the time, because it made me think about how, that's how my book starts as well. Like I was in Los Angeles realizing he would never see the Pacific Ocean. And I'm curious if there was, because I know this is fiction, but it's based on experiences you've had. Can you tell me about a time where you might have felt that way about your father, and how did that influence the way you started telling us about Charlotte and her story?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually felt that way about my father quite a bit. My father did pass away, so a lot of this was, the writing about grief was a true part of the story. And so
How old were you?
I was probably 28, 30, somewhere around there.
You were young.
Yeah, fairly young, but not as young as Charlotte. So I knew I was kind of ready to write about it when I started thinking kind of what if, like, oh, what if I had been a lot younger? What if my narrator was 19 and still not sure of herself, like who she was as a person?
Mhm.
And what if she actually could run away to the beach, which is all I wanted to do, was just, run away and look at the water and not have to do anything else as far as real life goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of the things that Charlotte is feeling, particularly in the beginning of the book, because I will say, hopefully without giving too much away, but tonally The book does change as it progresses through time, and as her grief kind of waves up and down. She starts off in this very, very melancholy, wintry place, and ends up somewhere different. But a lot of that stuff, like you asked about how my dad would never see a Hatteras winter, and that was something that really haunted me. It was just something that was so simple, almost. Like, it wasn't like, oh, my dad will never see Mount Kilimanjaro. It's like he would never go to the place that he loved in the winter, in the off season, because we'd never gone, because like we would always go in the summer just as tourists. But it was the small things like that that kind of stuck out to me, and would just, like I said, would just like really get under my skin and like really kind of bother me. Like you said about the Pacific Ocean, like here I am doing this thing that my dad wouldn't get a chance to do.
It's a striking realization, I think. And I think it's very, I don't want to say that it's unique to someone in their 20s, but to be, upfront about it, people in their 20s are going on a lot of brand new adventures, usually, right? And to suddenly recognize, oh, this person who I thought would be there a lot longer is not going to experience this with me. So I thought that was really smart and beautiful the way you put that. And I mean, that sort of leads into my next question, because one thing I could not stop thinking about while reading your book is there's this famous quote from Ernest Hemingway, which I'm sure you know, and I know I'm going to butcher it, but it's good. It's something to the effect of, "Get the weather in there, damn it!" Like, don't forget to tell us what's happening. And I thought about it a lot when I was writing my book, and you did it masterfully. I mean, we've now been told he would never see a Hatteras winter, so we know you're about to see a Hatteras winter. And the way that you use the setting and the weather and even hurricanes, it was so just I don't love it when someone uses metaphor and I know, oh, this is metaphor, and yours never felt that way. It just felt like what Charlotte's going through in her outer world is very much what's happening inside of her. So I guess I'm just curious, how do you learn how to do that, and how do you know how to blend the inner and the outer so well?
Yeah, I had a writing professor who would say, he would quote, I'd again, yeah, I'm gonna do the same thing in butcher, but I think he was quoting Eudora Welty, maybe. It was get your moon in the right part of the sky, like get your details
Oh,
correct. Yeah, I took that one to heart. So it for
yes,
me,
you did.
yeah. I was really like trying to get that moon right. And so for
Yeah.
me, that meant for me, and having the environment reflect her inner sort of inner state, it was about reaching for the right detail.
Mhm.
um and so I did want to start it in like this sort of bleak January, um with the wind and the tide, and I sort of realized at one point that like the Outer Banks are kind of this minimalist environment, which sort of struck me as I was putting the character in this mindset. But I wanted to reach for the right details, to sort of set that and like turn the light on, to her emotional state based on what the environment was doing. And yeah, I'm glad it didn't come off as heavy-handed, because yeah, I didn't want it to be just a metaphorical hurricane. Like, I wanted there to be like, it's the actual weather. Like, part of living on Hatteras is paying really, really close attention to the weather, because you are out in the middle of the ocean. Like, it is this real skinny strip of land in the middle of the ocean, and like you got to pay attention to what is going on, because the road might wash out, and if you need to go get off the island, you're not going to be able to. So people watch the weather carefully. So and there are a lot of storms, and the nor'easters, like in the beginning, there's a storm that kind of causes a lot of overwash and erosion, and those are often just as destructive as hurricanes, or nearly as destructive, but they don't get quite as much attention because they're not a hurricane. So stuff like that happens a lot. So I thought that that wasn't too out of character for the setting to have her experiencing these things. But also I did want it to reflect um her inner state. And part of that, I guess, was because it is a first person narration, she can just tell us a little bit how she's feeling, and have that. I think that's the really interesting thing about detail, about setting, about place is and voice, is that what the character is noticing is based on how they are feeling. So you can, the way she is going to describe the muted reeds, bending their heads low, um, in a melancholy frame of mind is going to be different than how she would describe something, even the same exact scene. If she was, overjoyed and happy, she would notice something else.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of where I was going with that.
Speaking of happy, last night, little behind the scenes here, Heather and I were talking about my little tricks for when I do these talks. So I just want you to know I'm holding my citrine today, which is my happy stone, because the thing about this book that I really want to emphasize, and we were just talking about this yesterday, it's funny. Like this is a book about grief, and you're not just going to cry, you're going to be laughing over and over again, which I thought was really smart because she's 19.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't help but think over and over again while reading this, ugh, why didn't Heather write this book 20 years ago? Like when
Right.
my father died and I was 25, I would have loved to have gone to a bookstore and found The Saddest Girl on the Beach and understood, oh, I can be this young person starting out my life and also be experiencing this. And there's
Yeah.
a place for it. And, one thing I was very curious about was, there's a beautiful story about a friendship where the friends are like family and the ups and downs of that. And, as you already told us, one of them has just recently discovered that she's pregnant. So you now have like a cycle of life thing happening, right? Where an end of one life and a beginning of another. But also in the beginning, it sort of almost has a young adult or romance voice to it, right? And it's not that, but there's a lightness to it. And I just kept thinking as I'm reading this book, oh, this is really helping me with my grief. But at the same time, I'm really excited to get to this party they're planning that they keep talking about. And that's in some of the best movies, where there's going to be a big event that's coming up. And you know I loved that kind of stuff when I was a kid, and some of my favorite books would use that device in the story. So I'm curious, but how did you decide, like, is this just a style of writing that you like? How did you decide that it was important to have that tone that had humor and whimsy to it?
Yeah, that was it. First of all, absolutely is a style that I like. Like I love books that are funny. I love books that are not even outright funny, but that have like this tragic element. But the characters are funny and they don't lose their sense of humor. Um, or there's like an unreliable narrator, and that's funny. Like I'm thinking about like Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine, or like Where'd You Go, Bernadette, where there are major things going on in the characters' lives, and yet it's really funny. And I think, and I've always found in both reading and writing that using humor and grief are not these like opposites, but they're on this continuum of intense emotion, and you don't necessarily lose one. Like you don't necessarily lose your sense of humor because you're in this state of mourning or state of grief or state of shock. Like it goes back and forth, but pitting them against each other, I think, highlights each one and heightens it. So I think um choosing a moment that is like deeply sad, deeply horrible, and then having a moment of lightness beside it kind of shines a light on almost both of the emotions. It makes like the funny thing funnier, and it makes the sad thing even sadder, or like hit you with the pathos of it even more deeply, because there is that humor to it. And like I don't think we lose our senses of humor when we're grieving. Like it was something that we always reach for. Like even like when my dad when my dad was like actively dying, he was still hilarious. Like it's just like kind of who we are. And
Well,
so I
yeah,
wanted to bring that in.
that's when it comes out more, I think.
Yeah.
And Evie is such a great character because it's like she's just gonna say what she thinks straight up, like my Sherpa phase, and she reminds me so much of my best friend who will just tell you exactly what she thinks. And someone who knows you that it's clear she knows Charlotte so well that she can just say anything like, "Are you naked in there?" We all need those people in our life who laugh at like inappropriate moments because that's what grief requires. And I mean, speaking of Evie, one of the things you did that I thought was really fascinating was, and I think this is how Charlotte is sort of finding ways to bring her father into her present day, like into the process and maybe coming towards some kind of acceptance. But I was wondering if you could speak to the decision, which I know you made later on after writing a first draft, of putting the science into the book, like the explanation of quarks, for example. Heather has these passages in the book where it's like she's explaining to you physics and like astronomy, but like you can be probably a 9-year old and understand what she's saying. And the way Charlotte, the main character, is incorporating this not only into like the romance she develops in the story, but also her grief. And then there's also this interesting tension, right? Because Evie and her family are a little bit more religious and maybe even superstitious because of living on the island for as long as they have. So can you tell us a little bit about what that was like, that choice?
Yeah, yeah. I think early on when I was drafting the book, I had this idea kind of in my head of pitting kind of science and spirituality kind of against each other. And then because I knew, well, I would say I knew as I was writing through Evie and her characters, her parents, her family, I knew that they were going to be have been historically like more traditionally religious or spiritual. And I also kind of knew that that would be one of the tensions that I wanted to play with, was that Charlotte maybe had been in a similar vein, but had that shattered like when her father died and was like questioning everything and did not want to hear about how it was God's will and how everything was, as it was meant to be, or it will just make her stronger. Or she like any of those references were not going to land. And so I made Charlotte's father have been sort of more scientific, like a geologist. So I wanted him sort of connected to the earth, sort of connected to things that were tangible. And then I wanted Charlotte to sort of, as she's having this crisis of faith, be leaning into, and it's not the opposite. Like, I think they're all tied together, but
Yeah.
leaning into the opposite, which is the more scientific, the more tangible, and to be leaning on that, like you were saying, as a way of bringing her father or her father's sort of spirit, a way of approaching the world into herself and her approach to life without him, um, and thereby kind of going full circle and finding herself back in a place of spirituality where she could almost say like, this is how I'm going to move forward, accepting that my father is gone, and accepting the scientific facts of that by reaching out to all these different aspects of science like geology and the oceanography and physics and all of the science of a barrier island. She leans into a lot, and I brought that into the book, quoting another book which actually was a nonfiction book about barrier islands, but as a way of her figuring it out and figuring out how to connect back to her dad in a new way, and sort of find a new sense of spirituality.
Yeah, I really love that because some books might alienate people who, like, let's say it's a book where the character's like, "Oh, I saw a cardinal today." That's my grandmother. Like, and I'm making fun of myself when I say that because I always think of my grandmother when I see
I think
cardinals.
of my grandmother with cardinals too.
It's a thing that my cousins and I do, and I was just informed by my husband yesterday that apparently it's a meme now. That women are doing this. But the truth, like like not to quote Hemingway again, but that well, another thing he used to always say about writing fiction is that your fiction should be truer than true, you know,
Yeah.
and I mean unwrap that. But
Yeah.
but what I think he meant was your story is about a person who isn't real, and
Right.
yet her journey is very real and it's very unique to her. And there are people who would prefer to remember their father who's just passed away through his passion for science,
Yeah.
through this passion for science she clearly has inherited. And so, like, the parts of the book where she's saying things like, I'm, are you out there, Dad? Like, seashells, are you trying to tell me something? Like, she's not looking to a bird, she's looking to shells, she's looking to the beach, the place that is her home. As Evie said earlier, your home. And she's like, I don't feel like I am. I just want to read one passage, if you don't mind, that particularly resonated with me that I rediscovered today. It's just so beautiful. Let's see. No one told me that I might travel through my grief and come back to myself, but that I wouldn't be the same, that there would always be a dividing line from who I am now and who I used to be, who I was before. No one told me that time would move differently, that I'd recognize how every moment will never, ever happen again, as if I was the one who was dying, that I would begin to realize that I am. No one told me that I'd feel guilty for still loving the way the sun warms my face, my arms, the back of my neck. No one told me that I'd always hold on, that no matter how hard I tried, I could never draw a tight enough circle around someone else's life. How does that feel to you to hear that read back to you?
That's like, woo, that's a little gut punch there.
It's one of the few passages I've ever read that encapsulates that feeling so well of someone who's 19, or in your case, 29, you said.
Yeah.
And no, it's like no one told me that when life ends, it feels this way. And that as hard as I might try, I don't know how to create a legacy for that person. But what I'm curious about is if once you reach the end of writing this book, if you shared those feelings with Charlotte, which I assume that you did, how did you feel about the grief for your father, and was it different from when you started?
Yeah, yeah. So when I started writing this book, it was probably about 6 months. It wasn't even a year after my father had passed away. And I had kind of done what Charlotte did, which was I had gone off to school, um, to grad school. And I spent a while kind of like she does, trying not to think about it and writing like, I don't know, silly short stories about a guy turning into a Ken doll. I'm like, I don't know. I wrote about like, I don't know, weird
That's
poems.
awesome.
Um, and then I started to write about it. And I started to plan it, and I started to put it into my fiction because I couldn't not put it into my fiction any longer. And so the like the emotional core of the book was like really real, really true, kind of like figuring out how this character moves through her grief. Was a lot of it was me moving through my grief. And so I wrote it for several years, just kind of kept going. So as Charlotte was moving through her, different phases, in a more compressed timeline, obviously, because it's a novel, but I was moving through it as well. And so coming to the end of it was really, I don't know if I have the right word. It was weird. I remember trying to figure out the ending of the book. Um, and I couldn't quite get it, or I thought I was like close to the end. And I kept trying to write more scenes, and nothing was working. And I thought it was done. And then I wrote that. What you wrote, I think what you read, that was initially like my last line of the book.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, yeah, you could never draw a tight enough circle around someone else's life. And I kind of realized I needed just to tell it. Like I just needed to just like, instead of showing, like some scene, I just needed to be like, talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that kind of like I knew it was done. Um, and I put it down. And then I remember like going on to grad school again, but I remember it had been 4 years since my dad had passed away. At that point, I was done with that book. I thought I was like ready to move on. And for some reason, that 4 year anniversary hit me like like the ton of bricks, like that 4 year anniversary, because it was the Olympics. That's what it was. Oh, and they're gonna start
Oh,
again. But
yeah.
when
Eerie.
yeah, because when he was dying, I remember we had the Olympics on and we were watching the gymnastics and the diving, and then 4 years later with the Olympics starting again, it was like for some reason like that Olympics was like I was just like doing the
Yeah.
ugly sobbing again, and that was about the same time that I finished the book, so it was sort of like
Oh,
this.
that's when you revisited it and revised it.
No, I didn't revise it till later, way later. I finished writing it
Oh,
around
it finished right. Okay.
so I did that final line, and then the Olympics happened, and then it was like it was all stirred up again, like it was fresh and new. And then after that, I kind of moved into a new phase. That phase did not include going back and revising the book. I wrote again, I kind of like wrote ridiculous stuff for a while, and messed around and played with short stories. And then I started writing The Baddest Girl on the Planet. So I actually wrote that second. Um, and that one was almost not necessarily a reaction, but it was extremely different tonally, because it was all in Evie's voice. And like you get a sense from that. I think maybe you get a sense from that little bit that I read that Evie and Charlotte are very different.
Yes.
So it was a lot of fun to write Evie, who just says and does whatever she wants, as opposed to Charlotte, who was, grieving and thinking through things. And Evie was just like going for it. And so I wrote that book and I revised that book and I spent a lot of time with that book because it was, no very limited emotional baggage to the baddest girl on the planet. And so I
Oh,
didn't
so
go
it
back.
got you in the flow, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
that proverbial flow that a writer needs to enter into. You had
Yeah.
gotten in there through a safer way, almost emotionally.
Yeah, exactly. Because I have to hit that state of flow. Like
Yeah.
I find it really hard to write for brief periods of time. Like I gotta have like a block of 4 hours on like and then like flow. And then like on a bigger project, like yeah, I need to like have that forward motion. And that's what got me there. Yeah, like a little bit safer emotionally.
It makes
And
sense. You feel it when you read it. You
right.
like, I forgot somebody wrote this. Like,
Right.
which is the goal, right? It's like I want to, like, I feel like I'm there, and that's why it's such a perfect beach read. Because when you go to the beach and you're just sitting there, it's like you want to escape into something else. And how cool that this is like this fun escape, but also is gonna heal you at the same
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I wanted it to be, I love beach reads like that you fall into completely. And that have a little meat to them, not like
Yeah.
entirely fluffy, but also have that sort of, oh, that humor and that like some attention to plot and things like that.
Very suspenseful. Yeah.
Yeah.
You definitely are like, I want to get back and see what happens to these
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. That's what I was
So
hoping.
I was going to ask you if you had any tips for other people who might want to turn a grief experience into a story, but I'm a little worried I might be running out of time. So I wonder if Stephanie, do you think we can start opening up the floor for questions for Heather?
We have time for that question, Laura.
Okay, well, let's go.
Let's do
Okay,
it.
now that I have the proper tone to asking this question, what during the really hard parts of writing about grief, and I'm sitting here holding both of my stones while thinking of this because that's how I dealt with it. I would always take my fear about how I might go into my subconscious to remember traumatic events. And sometimes I even went so far as to just hold this heart adventuring stone up to my heart. And I would say, it's in here. The fear is going in here so that I can do it. And I just wonder if you had to also channel emotional, difficult events from your own life to describe it as part of Charlotte's story. And what tips would you give to someone else who is hoping to do something similar and be successful as you were?
Yeah, I definitely had to channel. and not even as much as when I was writing, but when I was revising. Because when I finally locked into revising, because going back to it and fixing it up was almost what was harder than writing it the first time, just like putting it out there, getting through the draft. But when it came to going back into it and being able to look at it from a distance, I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it for a long time because of the emotional content of it. So when I finally was able to, and this was just a few years ago, probably 2021, when I finally got my littlest one in preschool, and I told myself, where there's like, I had like, I don't know, 2.5 hours a couple mornings a week, and I was like, I just have to do it. During those hours, like, what I have to do is I have to open the manuscript, and all I have to do is look at it. Like, I don't have to actually revise it. You just have to read it. And so like that's how I started tricking myself into it. And then once I started to read it, I started to revise it, and I found that I could do it, like, finally. So time, I think, for not necessarily for writing, like if you want to like write it, but then maybe take a little time before you go back and revise it. And then otherwise, like, I actually wrote an article about this for Writer's Digest about how to write about grief without bogging down your reader. So I forget what I wrote, but I know part of it was
It would be weird if you did remember word for word.
Let me
Sorry,
just
I couldn't help myself. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go continue quoting yourself.
There you go.
I'm just saying. No, really though. What did you write?
Yeah, I know part of it was just like, I know the first thing I wrote was like, just go there, but do it viscerally, like do it with sensory detail, do it like so it's nice and juicy, and just do it, go there. And then the other thing I don't remember writing about was don't lose the humor, like we talked about, like how those emotions can play off of each other. So all of that, I think, if you're leading to write about grief, I would say make sure you'll probably know when you're in the emotional space to approach it as a piece of writing. Like you had some time in between, like when your father passed away and the emotions of it, between finding his list and deciding to write about it, like
over a decade.
Over a decade. Yeah. And that's what it took for me to be able to revise it, and to look at it as a piece of writing, and to like shape it into the like art that I wanted it to shape it into, as opposed to me processing through losing my dad. So I think time is a big part of it. So time, those details, just going there, using humor, and yeah, just being able to eventually have that distance to be able to think of it as a piece of writing, as opposed to just emotional processing.
Well, I'm so grateful you did. This book, I mean, I saw a psychic once, and the psychic said to me, the reason you have to tell your story is because it's everybody's story, and they might not be able to tell it. And, it's such a gift to describe a process of grieving that is so universal and yet unique in this really fun, beautiful story at the same time. And it's a really challenging thing to do. And, people say sometimes things like, oh, just let the past be the past. But I really believe that it's the role of the artist to process that past and turn it into something beautiful so that other people can get something from it. So kudos to you for doing this. And I'm so glad that we all get to read it. Okay, does anyone have questions?
Hi. So yes, thank you both for the conversation so far. It's been great. The first question is actually a little bit about your first book, about the baddest girl on the planet, and specifically when you, if there was a time when this book wasn't going to involve Evie,
Oh.
um,
Oh,
from the first book. Yeah.
no, Evie was always there. Evie was always there. And in fact, like that, the friendship part of Saddest Girl on the Beach was always really important to me to write about and to explore, because I think these close female friendships are really important, really valuable in our lives. And I'd love to see that explored in literature. So yeah, Evie and Charlotte were always there. They were always together. From the time I think I first wrote about them in some exercise in college, and I described these two little girls meeting on the sand dune, and so it was always um, their friendship story was always not quite as central as the grief, but like a really like rock solid part of what I wanted the book to be about, like the aboutness of it. And so Evie and Charlotte were always there together. I didn't plan for Evie to have her own book. That was, like I said, that was kind of the rebounding when I finished Saddest Girl on the Beach, and I was like, oh, it's done. Shoot. And I couldn't go back and revise it because I wasn't ready. And eventually, what I did and what I wanted to find out was how Evie's marriage would end, because I knew something, maybe not to give away too much, but something that happens in Saddest Girl on the Beach is that Evie marries this guy who Charlotte really hates. Like she really just loathes him. And so I wanted to play with how that ends. And I suspected that Evie would just blow it up, because she wasn't just going to let things, fizzle out. She was going to do the thing. She was going to do it good. And that was like, that's going to be really fun to figure out what happened. And so I started writing that, and that's sort of how Evie's book started. So that I had absolutely no plan on giving her a book, but her voice kind of demanded it.
I mean, the next question that I'm just going to jump off of that because it just popped into my head. But you don't have to answer it if there's something to give away. But then, of course, are we going to see them again? Are you planning to tell us more about Evie and Charlotte?
Yeah, so I wasn't. Again, I was like, I have they're companion novels. You can read them separately, you can read them together, and I have one girl's story and the other girl's story, and I think we're done. And now I think we're not done. I think I'm not done. I think I want to see what happens to them in middle age. I think I want to see what happens to them with kids. I think I want to see what happens to their mothers. I want to weave that in, which was something I kind of just figured out. So I'm just sort of processing through this right now. And I kind of have an idea in my head, which I thought, like, after I finished these books, I thought I was just never going to have another idea again for the rest of my life for a while. So it was a relief to figure out an idea, and then realize that idea kind of dovetailed into these characters, and that seeing what happens as they're older, because it's kind of the titles, like they're girls at this point in their storylines. And so, like, what would happen to see them in their mid 40s, I think it would be interesting, and I think it would be a lot of fun. And so I'm trying to work through that right now. I don't have it quite figured out, but I think there's going to be more. I don't think they're quite done yet.
Makes me think of the movie Beaches a little bit.
Oh yeah. Oh my God, my best friend and I love that movie.
Oh, good. I'm so happy that's an influence.
Yeah, we love that movie. Man.
It shows their whole lives.
Yeah, their whole lives. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the next one would be the somethingist women on the something.
Women. Yeah.
What's left?
Yeah, that's great.
It's women by the pool.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go. Yeah, nobody take that. Nobody who's watching, like, it's spoken for. So mail it to yourself, Heather.
I better appear in the acknowledgments, Heather.
Yes, Laura's in the acknowledgments. Somebody get it postmarked.
I just want to feel like they're happy at midlife.
Yes. Yeah. I wanted them to come to a good place.
Yeah, that's great. And I just while we're on that, actually, as an aside, Laura, would you like to talk about anything that you have coming up, projects that you're working on
What are you working on? I
as
haven't
well?
asked you that.
Yeah.
Gosh,
Yeah.
something that's top secret that I can't talk
Okay.
about. That's very exciting.
No worries. We'll just be
And
excited in general.
yeah, give me a few months and maybe I can talk about it. But I am, other than that, you know what I've been doing a lot of these days? I've been teaching other people how to do their bucket lists. And that's been so fulfilling. I started with a Facebook group, and a woman, Stacey Lauren, had interviewed me on her podcast. She's like, why don't we do a bucket list challenge? Because that's kind of what she does with her group. Brought me in, did a book club, and then we walked them through basically my experience in my father's list. So now other people, I'm getting to watch other people have this awakening, sometimes at midlife, sometimes younger, of, oh, I can have a list of things I want to do and actually go after them. And to be the person who's sort of shepherding them. And now I'm teaching it with the actress Melissa Gilbert's community, Modern Prairie. That's been such a cool development of the book that I never could have imagined would happen. And I hope to keep doing that throughout whatever iterations of the book exist and whatever other books I might write. And I love what you said, Heather, that feeling of, can I have a new idea?
Right.
Will I ever have another one? I got
Yeah.
really sick back in April and like had to have a week on my back because I like couldn't breathe. I was so sick. And then all I could do was watch like travel shows, and suddenly like new ideas started to emerge. So I think I might have an idea for a second book that will play out soon.
Nice.
Excellent.
Thank you for asking.
Of course, yeah. So we have another audience question. What was the, and I'm thinking this is for you, Heather. It doesn't say, but I'm gonna go with that. What was because it seems like it's about the fiction. What was the easiest literary aspect when it came to writing the book?
Oh yeah, good question. For The Saddest Girl on the Beach, I think the easiest literary aspect was writing the description and the setting, because part of my kind of impetus for writing it was because like I said, I couldn't just run away to the beach and look at the water, but I wanted to run away to the beach and look at the water. And so being able to describe it and put myself there came really easily, and came like maybe a little too easily, to where I was like, I have to also make something happen and have a story happen. Just sit and like write about the sea oats and how they wave in the wind. So I think that came pretty easily and carried through, just because I was trying to capture it, and because it is a real place, and a real place that's actually really important to me. Writing about that felt really easy and felt really natural. Yeah, and some of the other aspects, like making the stuff happen, were a little harder. But I think that was nice to just like lean into. I liked that part, and it came pretty easily. Dialogue, I think, came fairly easily. Elements of plot, that's harder for me. So I gotta like think about how to make the stuff happen and what needs to happen. Great question.
Yeah, it is a good question. Yeah, thank you. And that sort of gives me another question. Laura, you had mentioned earlier about metaphors, and not necessarily enjoying it when a metaphor sort of jumps up and says, I'm a metaphor at you. Right. And one of the things that we end up oftentimes talking about with authors is tropes, and how wonderful they can be, and how how some folks can lean into them and really work for them, or how how other times maybe you feel like that's not what needs to happen, and that's leaned into heavily. And since you talked about sort of beaches and that and I think that and writing about female friendships, a lot of times there are sort of tropes that, you know, manifest, right, when we have these thoughts and conversations. And so I'm curious about where you come down on the trope front, and if any of that was, you know, at work when you were looking at these characters and what happens to them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I like I said, like I tend to fall into the description stuff comes easily and naturally. I tend to fall into a project based more on that than on the trope or the plot or the storyline. So I wasn't necessarily thinking in terms of tropes, but they absolutely can be helpful. And I think as long as, well, personally, I like to like, you know, twist them a little bit or like mess with them so it's not
Yeah.
not beating you over the head and not kind
Yeah.
of, yeah,
That's what can be so great. You know, you
yeah,
recognize it, but it's still its own thing.
a little different, yeah, a
Yeah.
little twist on it because I mean, we exist in stories and like that, like the stories tend to repeat and that's why there are tropes and like there's nothing less literary about it. There's just like different ways of approaching it. Like literary fiction itself is a trope. Like that's what we like, the things we're paying attention to are things that are recognizable as literary fiction. So it's like why not use like the trope of female friendship, or why not use the love triangle, because this is kind of these tropes that exist through life and are recognizable and fun to play with and useful in developing things like plot if you're an author that doesn't really like that. So I don't know, I think they come in handy. And I kind of like being able to recognize things a little bit, but also have it be a little twist on it.
You know what I love about Charlotte though is it's almost like she's such a self-aware person, like a character that even if she is sort of in a trope, she's like, how did this happen to me? Like how, oh, like Kiss in the Rain, I guess maybe that could be considered a trope, but it doesn't feel like one because it's so unique to her.
Right. Well, I made her a poet, so I made her like be the self-reflected person with
Yes.
a deep attention to language, and these ideas of things. So that was kind of
Yeah.
the trick that I used. Yeah.
Nerdy girls unite.
Pretty girls.
I was very happy about that.
For sure. So we're almost at the top of the hour. It's gone really quickly. And so we've got time in the last couple minutes. I'd love to hear just any final thoughts from both of you before we say goodnight to our audience. Yeah. Laura, let's start with you, and then we'll give Heather the last word.
I guess my question, just selfishly for you, Heather, I am kind of curious about writing fiction, and I'm wondering if what advice you would have for someone who typically writes nonfiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
You are a teacher, right?
yeah. I just today wrapped up a creative writing class. So we looked at a lot of different aspects of fiction. So I think about the things that setting can do. Think about how you want the story to be paced. Think about structure. Structure is like a big key for me. Like it kind of unlocks things. Thinking about how I want to tell the story, thinking about what story I want to tell, and then how I want to tell it. Like what what verb tense do I want to use? Do I want to, it's talking about tropes, like do I want to use a particular form? Like in Baddest Girl on the Planet, like I wanted to write a chapter about Evie and kind of like her bad reputation, but I wanted to do it in the epistolary form, so I wanted to write it like a letter. And so like knowing that I wanted to write it like a letter kind of unlocked a lot of stuff for me. And I knew I wanted it in first person because I wanted her voice writing the letter. So thinking about it in those terms can be really helpful. And then just looking at all the sort of classic aspects of like the plot arc, thinking about dialogue, and thinking about where you want things to be in a scene and where you want the character to be talking. So like showing and telling. For me, integrating those two is important because I think the telling part can be just as valuable as the showing part. But like a lot of the Saddest Girl on the beach, I wanted it to be showing in into a point where I almost slipped too far into showing. And in revision, I'm like, well, she can talk too. Like she can just like tell us stuff. So just like telling us the story, and just like figuring things like that out as you go into planning it, I think are helpful. Hope that wasn't too technical. That was kind of technical.
No, I'm very grateful. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think I'm good. This has been so lovely. This has been so wonderful. And just thank you so much, Laura and Stephanie. And Laura, thank you for reading the book and blurbing it. Like that was super helpful. I knew when I heard Laura talk in Greensboro like last year, I think. And as she was speaking, I was just like crying because she was talking about her dad and talking about her book and how she went about fulfilling her father's list and how she sensed his presence. And I could tell it was just like resonating with the audience. And I was like in tears and I was like, oh my gosh, I want to talk to her. And I didn't want to go up and be like, I didn't want to go up and be a weirdo and be like, I just wrote a book about my dead dad too. Do you want to read it? But at the same time, I'm like, she gets it. I know she gets it. And I want to be friends with her. So,
I hope that's not my computer making that noise.
oh, I think that's me. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Cool. No, because if it were, I would be like, "Hi, Dad." No, I mean, I'm happy you told that story because, of course, I did not at all think that about you. I was like, "Oh, cool, another one."
Yeah, exactly.
And I like to talk about that a lot actually when I do talks because I think one of the things that people who are sort of nervous about telling their story, whether they're a fiction writer and they're using elements of their real life or they are writing it straight memoir like I did, one of the things that makes them nervous is like, do I have a right to use my voice? Is my voice going to be rejected by people? Are people going to relate to it? And that saying within the specific lies the universal is so true. Like you do need to tell it from your perspective and feel free to do it. You don't have to ever show it to anyone, but just get it out. And then as you start to become more comfortable and can see the good it might do if you show it to people, what you're going to learn is how many other yous there are out there in the world. And I'm so grateful that we got the chance to meet and become friends because we both were brave enough to do this. Or I don't know, I'm not trying to pat us on the back, not brave enough, but felt compelled to tell these stories. Because that is wouldn't you say that's what it really feels like you have to?
Yeah, like you have to tell it. Yeah, exactly. And like learning to talk about this book was another big learning curve for me. And so because like talking about the baddest girl on the planet was easy because it was like bright and funny and snappy and like punch you in the face, kind of like here's a beach read. I don't know, it was fun. And like how do I talk about a novel about grief, and make it sound appealing, make it not sound like, oh, this is going to be a downer. And what I keep landing on was just connection and like finding a way to connect to the readers it needs to connect to, which sounds kind of more like, I don't know, sounds more like kind of like,
well, really grief is a transition, right? I mean, it's a transition we all go through. Like when I think about what compelled me, or not what compelled me, but what was the catalyst for me starting my book, it was I got married, and those kinds of things come up in books about grief a lot because it's like it's a crossroads in your life.
Right.
It doesn't have to be a downer. It's just change.
It's just change. Yeah. Big change. Yeah. So like finding a way to talk about that and connect, I think has been really important. And I think that hearing you talk about it and realizing that was very helpful to me. And so I'm very grateful for that.
Well, our mutual friend JT had a lot to do with that.
JT
was my interviewer.
He's the best.
And I think you mentioned earlier, Stephanie, what books are we reading? JT Hill's Blind Man's Bluff is one of my favorite books.
Yeah, it's a great book. We did an event with him as well. It was
and just all around great person too.
Yeah,
and very funny. Like one of the funniest people I know.
He does that like funny tragedy thing really, really well. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yes, totally.
Great. Thank you for that. Yeah, happy to give him a plug in Blind Man's Bluff. Yeah. Heather, do you want to get in a book recommendation before we go as well?
Oh, sure. I will. I will recommend a thriller. Speaking about tropes again, this is a thriller called The Deepest Lake by Andromeda Romano Lax. I just read this. It's set in Guatemala on Lake Atitlan, which is, the deepest lake. But it's set in a memoir writing workshop, and there's a murder mystery and talking about writing and talking about mother-daughter relationships, which is another thing I love to read. And it's a thriller, and I loved it.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you for adding to our to folks TBR piles. We always love to do that. It's been a pleasure to spend this time with both of you, Heather and Laura. Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's been with us. Thanks if you're watching the video later. We appreciate you. And we hope to see you again. And then until that time, please take good care of yourself, stay dry.